So open to Acts chapter 20, verse 7. The story speaks for itself. Let me read it to you. Join me. It's Acts chapter 20, verse 7. Here it is. On the first day of the week, we gathered with the local believers to share in the Lord's Supper. Paul was preaching to them, and since he was leaving the next day, he kept talking until midnight. The upstairs room where we met was lighted with many flickering lamps. As Paul spoke on and on, a young man named Eutychus, sitting on the windowsill, became very drowsy. Finally, he fell sound asleep and dropped 3 stories to his death below. Paul went down, bent over him, and took him into his arms. "Don't worry," he said, "he's alive." Then they all went back upstairs, shared in the Lord's Supper, and ate together. Paul continued talking to them until dawn, and then he left. Meanwhile, the young man was taken home alive and well, and everyone was greatly relieved. That's a fun story. Now, that's a fun story. That is why this building is built on a slab at ground level, okay? That is why we did that. It's a funny story, right? And it's interesting when you think about it, and the reality is there really is 2 approaches to this story. There's really 2 perspectives on kind of how people deal with it. They take it and they use it, and sometimes for their own agenda. And so with that in mind, there's really 2 perspectives. The first being the perspective of the preacher. The first perspective would be the preacher's perspective. He would say this, and he would use this text, and he would say, "Are you serious, man? You don't love Jesus enough to stay awake for one sermon?" Now, that sermon was all night. But you seriously don't love Jesus enough to stay awake? Well, you got what you deserved. He would go on, maybe, and that preacher would then maybe continue and say, "You know what, if you continue to fall asleep during the words of God and the gospel that saves the universe from eternal damnation, if you fall asleep during that, you must not be saved." Hope that's not true, right? Whoa. I mean, that would be maybe one of the perspectives that was taken here, and the application maybe used at the end of that sermon from that pastor. That application would perhaps be, we need to take our faith seriously enough that we stay awake during one sermon. Then there's the other perspective from the listener, and it would go something like this: "Come on, man. Shut up. Like, don't you realize that we're over this? We're done. Like, do you not take the gospel seriously enough to know, like, you're beating it up? You're abusing it. You're not taking it seriously enough to understand how important your task of communicator is." And people would look at that pastor and would say, "You are not respecting the gospel enough to be a good enough communicator to keep him awake." The application from the end of that sermon would probably be something like, that preacher is being negligent of the gospel and not valuing his responsibility enough to communicate well. And in fact, there have been books written on both sides of this text. From the same text, you get both sides of that. There have actually been books written about Eutychus to pastors, and the entire purpose of the entire book was to teach them how to be better communicators, because they looked at Eutychus as the ultimate example of Paul being a bad pastor, a bad preacher. And so we don't want to be Eutychus preachers. That's the entire books. And so we approach this text this morning, and I guess I want to look at it, I want to analyze it, I just kind of want to study through it with you this morning. What if the truth is neither one of those and somewhere healthily in the middle, and there's a lot for us to be taken from this? What if there's really something for us to really learn from here? And God's point in this text is not to condemn either one of those sides, but there's some major point of application for us to take from this today. So before we get to that point, I guess, let's just look at what we know. Let's look at who's in this text and what's going on. I'm just going to read the first verse before this, so verse 6. I'll start in verse 5, I guess. They went on ahead and waited for us at Troas. It just gets done listing a bunch of people that are traveling with Paul. A bunch of their names. You can read them if you want. But they go on ahead to the place called Troas, and that's where Eutychus is found. Verse 6 says, after the Passover ended, we boarded a ship at Philippi in Macedonia, and 5 days later we joined them in Troas, where we stayed a week. So we know that Paul and his entourage and the people that already went in front of Paul, they get to Troas, and once Paul gets there, he's there for 1 week. 1 week. Just 1 week. We know that this group gets there and that they are pastors to the Gentiles. That is really what Paul is doing, especially in this juncture of his missionary journeys. He is preaching to Gentiles. He's preaching to people who do not know God at all, either from a Jewish perspective or a Christian perspective. Like that's who he has been preaching to. Yet when he gets to Troas, it's very clear to mention to us that he is speaking. He finds a group of believers. So in Troas, the gospel has been preached in some form or fashion, and that there is a church established there. There is a group of believers there. So when Paul and his entourage, when they get there, they find their brothers and sisters in Christ. And we know that they're only there for 1 week. And we know the church is brand new. We know the church hasn't been around but maybe for a couple years at this point. We don't know how long the church in Troas has been there. Maybe it's brand new. Maybe it's been there for a little bit. But either way, these are new Christians. These are Christians who really have not had a ton of exposure to the gospel teaching. And they certainly haven't had a ton of exposure from one of the best communicators in the universe, Paul. And yet Paul finds himself in this place for 1 week. And so you've got to understand, we've got to kind of imagine that it is probably significant that these believers get to hear the Apostle Paul. We know that as we read through the text, as we begin to look at the worship service as a whole, we find ourselves in this building, in this house of some kind. It's at least a couple stories. The NLT says 3. Depending on architecture, it might be like 2 or 2.5 or 3, depending on kind of how you dig into the ground. But they're up in the air a bit, okay? They're in that top story, okay? And it is late. Regardless of how you kind of translate the Greek here, and regardless of kind of how you view the days, some would say it's either from sundown to sundown, that's a day, or some would say it's from midnight to midnight, that's a day. It doesn't matter. We find ourselves late at night after a full day's work. This is after the working day. And regardless of how you view the day or how you view first century time kept on a Jewish clock or calendar, it doesn't really matter. We know that this goes this thing starts after bedtime. This service starts after everybody in that room should have already been asleep. It is late. We know it goes past midnight. This is significant. This is a big deal, that this is what is going on. It starts well after you and I should have been in bed. So that's what we know about Paul. We know he's there. We know he gets one shot, and we know that this is his last night there. So he's got one more shot with these believers to teach, to encourage, to rebuke, to correct, whatever it takes. He's got one shot with these Christians before he moves on. And we know that after this, he's on the last roads to his death. We know that Paul is going to be on his way to Rome. We know that's where Paul's going to spend the rest of his life and he's going to find his death. Like, we know that Paul, his mission journeys are about over as far as these guys will go. He'll probably never see these people again. And so he's got 1 night left. 1 night. So now the other character in the story, Eutychus. Fun name. Eutychus. You don't hear too many Christian families naming their sons Eutychus. Why? Because he's the kid who fell asleep in church. Eutychus. It says he's a young man. He's probably a teenager. Might be a young teenager. Might barely be a teenager. Young guy, which is important to understand. Now think about that for a moment. We have a group of believers that are meeting well past bedtime because they want to hear one last message from the Apostle Paul. This is by choice. This isn't a mandatory meeting. This isn't something they have to be at. This is something these people have chosen to go to. And yet we find a young man. We find a teenager who has made it a priority to be here at this meeting well past bedtime. It just goes to show that this gospel message that you and I proclaim and preach and adhere to and live in faith by, this is not an age-specific message. And shame on us for ever beginning to think that. Or that our age demographic is more important than another age demographic or less important or whatever. Shame on us when we get to that point. Because here in this story, we have a young man, and that's certainly not the point of this text, and I don't want to hammer on that, but we have a teenager that has made it a priority to be in this place to hear Paul. And so a challenge like all the teenagers in the room. Man, I love seeing you on stage. I love seeing that you're taking these leadership responsibilities so extremely seriously. I know how hard it is to be on stage. I know how hard it is to stand in front of your peers and your family and people you don't know. I get it. I get it. And I am so excited to see you beginning to take these leadership roles. And in church, you don't even get to see all the times that these kids are stepping up. There's more and more of them every single week in our Sunday school classes because they want to know. And we want to tell them. And so we have this really interesting story in the New Testament. We've got a teenager taking his faith seriously, where he is giving up sleep, he's worked today, he is coming to hear the message of the gospel. And he certainly doesn't need to be there. And there's probably a lot of teenagers that said, I'm not going to be there. He is. Now, the funny thing about the name Eutychus, depending on who you read, depending on the historian, depending on the commentator, depending on the cultural specialist you study, there's something interesting about the name Eutychus. Eutychus is a name that's often found with slaves. Not exclusive. There were people named Eutychus that weren't slaves. There were people who were slaves that were named something other than Eutychus, but for whatever reason, Eutychus is a name that was often used for people who were slaves. You know what Eutychus actually means? It means lucky. It means man of fortune, man of good luck. So here we have Eutychus, who's a teenager, who could be a slave. Now again, slavery in first century is nothing like what we think of in American history. It's different. But still, a slave falls out of a window and dies named Lucky. Bummer. Yet we have this young man who could potentially be a slave, and what that helps us understand is this kid, for sure, worked all day. And even if he wasn't a slave, he worked all day. Do you know why? Because that's what teenage boys did. They worked all day. As soon as they could, as soon as they had abilities, they were working. Hint, teenage boys in the room. So regardless if he's a slave or not, he was a working man. And after a full day's work with all these grown men, goes to a gospel meeting well into the hours of the night to hear the message of Paul one last time before he leaves. Now, here's what's interesting. We know that it's up in this room. It tells us there's flickering lights, and it means it's probably pretty warm. It means all these lights, you're kind of falling asleep, dozing off. We know poor Eutychus, he succumbs to the sleep, and he falls out the window, and he dies. And some people would argue, he didn't actually die, he just knocked himself out. Okay, so there's an interesting pronoun in this text. It's the we pronoun. It says we were there. And so we believe that Luke wrote this gospel, the gospel writer Luke the apostle, Luke the doctor. So if Dr. Luke was writing Acts as I believe history indicates he was, and if Dr. Luke is in this place, and Dr. Luke wrote that he fell dead, I think Dr. Luke is qualified to say, poor Eutychus fell to the ground, cracked his head open, and he was gone. Paul runs downstairs. He says, it's okay, guys, he's alive. You're better than a doornail, Paul. It says in the other Gospels, they write down that he lays himself on Eutychus and he brings him back to life. And here's what's interesting about this text. It says that they all went back upstairs. They had a Last Supper, they had communion, and they went right back at it. Paul, without wavering, gets right back at the gospel. He jumps right in. He goes to town. And so here's what's funny. Nobody in that room seemed to think that sermon was too long. Or they probably would have left when the guy died. And they went right back upstairs and they went back to town on the gospel. And so here's where we find ourselves uniquely in this text. Sure, a pastor can take this text and he can lambaste everybody in his room that's asleep. He'd preach every week that sermon. Or people can lambaste their pastor because they think he preaches too long. Probably preach that sermon every week too. Or we can really look at maybe what's going on here. And we can really begin to ask ourselves some pretty important pointed questions. We have this scenario where people would accuse Paul of being a bad communicator or not respecting the gospel enough to know when to shut up or whatever. We could say all these things. Here's what I know about Paul. That next to Jesus Christ, he's probably the best preacher this world's seen. He has spoken to thousands. He has won thousands. He has debated with the most brilliant Gentile, heathen, pagan minds on the planet to that day at the Areopagus and won them. He's lived valiantly. He has spoke intelligently. He has communicated articulately. The Apostle Paul is a lot of things. He may be a stinker, he may be arrogant, he may be stubborn, he may be all of those things. You can fill in the blank, but he is not, in my opinion, boring. He knew he had one chance to look these people for the last time in their eyes and tell them the most amazing gospel truth that has ever entered the universe. And he has one shot to bolster them and charge them and convict them and get them to be the church. And he doesn't waste a second. He doesn't stop. He doesn't waste a second. He preaches until he leaves. Paul may be a lot of things, but I don't think he's a bad communicator. Then you look at Eutychus. And we would harp on Eutychus. Oh, that lazy kid. Oh, man, he doesn't love Jesus enough. Oh, he doesn't get it. He doesn't realize that. Are you serious? And shame on the pastors who've used Eutychus to condemn their church. Eutychus is a boy who wanted so desperately to know the gospel, he works a full day and then goes to a gospel meeting to midnight and well past it, falls out of a window, dies, and goes right back up. This kid is hungry and thirsty for the gospel. Like so much so, he died. He died. Oh, sure now, Joshua, he just died falling asleep. He died. That seems pretty significant to me. And yet every one of them went back up that stair and they waited till Paul was done. Because the gospel was so important to them. They gave up a night of sleep. They gave up a night of comfort. They went to work the next day dog tired. Why? Because the gospel was that important. Because the gospel is that significant to their life. So here we go. We have this scenario like, so where do we take this? What's the application from us, for us, as we go out into the world? Like as a preacher, I have to tell you, there's a lot of conviction here for me. Like it's very convicting to me. I have to take seriously, and you've got to understand that I take very seriously my role as a communicator, my role as a teacher, my role as a gospel preacher. I understand that I have an obligation to the truth of the Scripture, to the grace of God's Word, that I have to communicate well in a way that is honest, that is truthful, that is engaging, that is convicting, and that is beyond all truthful. We can sacrifice no grace for truth and no truth for grace. And then we have to walk that narrow, fine line. And that is my job to make sure I engage with you in a way that you understand the gospel in such a real way that you can't wait to leave here to go do it. And then you can't wait to come back to be encouraged by your brothers and sisters in this place. And in the meantime, you get to hear another gospel message that we get convicted enough to go do it again. Like that's the role of any gospel communicator, whether it be a teacher, Sunday school teacher, pastor, preacher, whatever. Like that's our job as communicators. Sunday school teachers, you fall right in this. Elders, oh man, you're right on the top of it. I mean, everybody in this room, small group facilitators and hosts, like this is our job, that we communicate the gospel so effectively. Like we can't take this lightly. And we look at the story of Eutychus. Man, this poor kid, yeah, his story is something. But I can't help but seeing a teenager who loved God so much. He gave up all of his comforts that night. He knew he was tired, and he went and did it anyway. And how many of us heard the alarm go off this morning, go, ooh, 9 more minutes, snooze. 9 more minutes, snooze. How many times have we not gotten out of bed? How many times have we chose not to do something because we're just too tired? Now I get it, guys. I know we can't do everything, and I don't think we should. We have to say, no, I'm not. I get it. But when it comes to the gospel, how important do we take it? How significant is it to us? How important is it to our daily life? Is it important enough that we'd wake up an hour early to read? Ask yourself, hear me. Hear me. Is the gospel message important enough to you that we would give up an hour of our sleep at night to wake up 1 hour earlier to give God 1 hour before any other hours of the day? Oh, it's hard. I get it. I got 3 kids. My alarm goes off every day at 5:03. I swear my finger just automatically hits snooze. I try so hard to get up. It's so hard sometimes. I get it. Man, I try to give God that first hour, and that first hour often turned into the first half hour. But is the gospel important enough that we would sacrifice a little bit of sleep, a little bit of comfort, to make sure God knows that He is first for us? There's 1,000 ways you could probably learn from this story of Eutychus and Paul and preaching and listening. But I can't help but see a room full of people who were there after midnight to hear about Jesus. Man, they gave up a lot for that. One guy died and fell out of a window. So, I ask you, how important is the message of the gospel? And here's how we end. Don't forget the rest of the story. Don't forget the most significant part of this story. It's not Paul. It's not how he talked. It's certainly not Eutychus and how he fell asleep and fell out of a window. That's not the most important part of this at all. The most important part of this story, and the part that we always skip over because we get enamored by Eutychus, is the fact that God raised a dead man to life. What a beautiful image. Like man, like if I was preaching and I'm trying to tell people about the new life that God promises Christians, if I'm trying to tell people about like how Jesus gives everybody new life, thank you, Nathaniel, that we get a new faith, a new life, a new beginning, a new eternity. We get all of this new stuff. If I'm trying to communicate how Jesus has done all of this great new stuff for us and how there is a death to old self and life to new self, if I am preaching this message and some kid falls out of a window and dies, I can't wait to go to the ground and jump on him and show him what I mean. God raised this kid to death. You imagine Paul went back up there and he goes, that's what I'm talking about. That's my God. That's what He does for every single one of you at a spiritual, eternal level. You want to know what Jesus does for you? He does that. Eutychus, how you feeling, buddy? I feel good, Paul. I'm awake. Like we serve a God that is so awesome, He raises dead things to live things. He promises that with every single one of us in every single one of our lives at every single moment of our day. And that is why the gospel is so important. It's not just an idea. It's not just something that's good sense. It is something that promises life. And so we miss that because we get hammered down by Paul and by Eutychus and all these things. Life is the center of this story. And that's why the message was so important. He preached all night. And everybody sat there for it. Church. If I'm being honest, I think y'all could stay awake for the 35 or 40. What if I preach for an hour? I think you could. I think you could stay awake. I'm not Paul. I'm not going to say I'm that good. I know I'm not. But if I'm being honest, the gospel is good enough without any communicator. It's good enough without Paul. It's good enough without Joshua. It's good enough without any of us. The gospel is good enough to drive us to tell people because it is God's words. It is the promise of Jesus. May we always be driven and motivated by the words of the gospel, not the words of a talking head. How important is the gospel to each and every one of us? We are promised life from it.